that with all history, who seems to be writing the history? It seems like most of the everyday people don't get to tell their story. It seems to be lost to history. Um, do you know of any place where there seems to be a lot more accounts or information or resources regarding like firsthand accounts of people who aren't major actors in the civil rights movement or throughout the civil rights movement?
That's a really good question. And what we're talking about in terms of the local movements, the community studies, almost all of those studies are rooted in oral histories with participants from those lesser known figures. They have to be, because a lot of times they don't fall into the documentary record in the same way as the more notable figures. The press covers the leaders, right? So to get underneath those, and really sort of oral history is at the backbone of so many of those great community studies that start to get done in the 1990s, especially in the 2000s and now. So it's absolutely essential to who you're going to tell the story that shapes what the civil rights movement looks like. And so the more you get off those very well-known figures, the more you see the contours of what we call the new civil rights history.
I was wondering about the context of the current voting conflict in the country between states that want voter ID laws and a bigger movement of people that are not bigger, but a movement of people that also want to ensure that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 doesn't get diminished, that we can ensure voting rights, like how that plays into it, and where we lost some ground with that. Like, why are we still kind of fighting to ensure that everybody has access to voting? How do we get here? Yeah.
I think it's key to see that as kind of an ongoing process, because the question about universal access to voting was a question that was always sort of up for grabs. And if you think about how, like, the way that now you see civil rights veterans responding to some of the recent changes in voting laws on a state level, and they draw explicit parallels back to the 1960s. So, for instance, just an example from Mississippi in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act and just the beginnings of an uptake in Black voting. Mississippi had the lowest rates of Black voter registration, but a lot of white politicians saw the writing on the wall, and they quickly redistricted Mississippi to make the Mississippi Delta one voting district, to concentrate all the Black vote in one place. Because they realized that as there were going to be more Black voters, they were going to start to shift the political balance going on. This was in 1965. The Voting Rights Act created this, had an article within it that gave the federal government the right to review any changes that could potentially shape racial participation in voting. But that was stripped, but as you probably know from the 2013 Shelby ruling by the Supreme Court, that was thrown out. That aspect was thrown out. So it depends who's, this is continually shaped by who's making the laws and who's deciding. It's no accident that right after Shelby, states immediately started passing laws that change access to the vote, and they were all the states of the former Confederacy. They were the states that the Voting Rights Act was specifically designed to stop from doing that. Other questions?
Yes, I'm sorry, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes, I can.
Okay. In my district, we have this new thing, they call it the 360 view. And basically they want us to incorporate all aspects of, I guess, everything that we teach in regards to history or historical context. So in regards to the civil rights, I guess they want us to think about it from everyone's point of view. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a focus on minorities, but other like points of view.
Okay. That strikes me as something that might interestingly backfire on the kinds of on the kinds of people who would be pushing for those kinds of guidelines. So if you think about what the civil rights movement would look like in the next webinar, for instance, we'll look at it, will be in Alabama in 1963, right? All right, who's the most important political figure in Alabama in 1963? It's George Wallace, the new governor, who is proclaiming segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, right? And is recognizing that the philosophy of massive resistance is political gold for him. Well, that's an important. If that's the person who's just the duly elected official in Alabama, it speaks to the kinds of resistance that civil rights activists face. As we're telling the story, right? Obviously, even that new old civil rights history, like that was a very condensed version, and there are lots of things that were left out of that. And there are white people who are also active in the movement, and of course, the civil rights movement has effects beyond simply the African American struggle for civil rights. And in Texas, of course, Texas is the best example of that, right? Because it's not just a Black movement; it's also a brown movement, right? And it doesn't look the same as it looks in the traditional Deep South. So there could be a lot of value, I would imagine, in that kind of 360 approach. I mean, as historians, that's kind of our goal, right? We want our students to see the world through different people's eyes. And a lot of times primary sources are a great lens into that. Like I have some suggestions for some primary sources that aren't specifically to what you're saying, Ms. Nicole, but do at least put them in conversation with each other.
Thank you. That was a very good answer. Thank you.
Can I answer any other questions?
Well, I mean, I guess I would like to ask, first off, thank you. I mean, I do a master's degree thesis on civil rights student stuff, so like I'm super into this whole thing. It's so much, it's good information. I love it. So, as a high school teacher, obviously in our current environment with just the CRT nonsense that's happening, I'm always looking for, and I've not seen the materials, and maybe you're about to cover them, and there's going to be something there. And I also couldn't get my Google Classroom code to do because of the email. So I had to talk to somebody about that. The point of my question is, I'm looking for a good source where I could find like a consumable article that I can like show in class that are ones that tend to be standing up the best. Not that we even have enough experience to know what's standing up against things, but I'm trying to find a way to have these really important conversations, but also have such solid stuff that I don't have to deal with worrying about any of the noise that's kind of around what shouldn't even be controversial information, especially when it's doing such a good job of, including the role of women in the system of Black college. There's really important, interesting layers being added. And so as this is expanding, it's like our voice to discuss this is shrinking. So there isn't really a quick answer. I guess I'm really hoping that there's going to be some kind of resources or some website that you can direct us to that might be high school friendly, and you might not even have that specialty to even be worried about that, but I'm kind of looking for that information for sure.
I think, the balancing act that you have to engage in now, I am very sympathetic towards how difficult that must be for teachers now. Of course, you're trying to engage in sort of fact-based learning, and it seems like part of what you're being asked to do is you're not being told not to, but you're being discouraged from doing so, as I understand, right? The things that you're not supposed to do, I don't think that most people do that, right? We're not saying one race is superior to the other or anything like that, but we are complicating people's stories, right? We are making history harder, right? And that's the job of a teacher, right? Whether that is high school or college. So the way that I often think to frame it is, and this is probably the key running theme in my webinar next week, is about the idea of democracy, right? Everyone believes in democracy, but what is democracy? What does it look like? What are these different visions of democracy, of what American democracy is? Who gets to participate in that democracy? One of the things I think that liberals have often ceded the ground on is the idea of patriotism, right? Is the idea of loving your country, right? But they don't expressly proclaim that. But that's an easy way in sometimes to say, look, if you love your country, then like you love your spouse, you love your kids, you love your parents. You don't just accept them uncritically, right? You want them to be better just as they want you to be better, right? The same should be true with your country, right? That you love it for what it's for its great qualities, and you aspire for it to be better, right? And that can be a language maybe that gets, again, I don't know the precise situations that you guys have to deal with, and they're extraordinary, I think, but maybe that's a way into that. So I'll get more into engage with that issue of democracy as we get into the next week's webinar, but I do have your question does kind of lead me into some of those documents. Let me share the screen one more time, please. All right, so you're asking, Ms. Graham, about websites or places to grab sources. These are two that I think are really useful and valuable. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is filled with all these great primary sources on American history, and it has and you can filter through African American history and through civil rights. And then there's another one called blackpast.org that is focused in particular on African American history. That isn't as easily searchable. Some of the filters on it they're not as effective, but it's all organized chronologically, so you can get to where you need to be in terms of time period. And they're full of just these great speeches, writings, court cases, etc. All sorts of primary sources that can be very valuable. And so from those, just as sort of like a exercise here, you can sort of pair, I think, different documents together into a conversation with each other. We can put documents in conversation, and this helps students not to just see, sort of one aspect of an idea, but make them talk to each other. So as an example, I have here A. Philip Randolph in sort of to talk about the long civil rights movement during World War II, saying, we need to be politically active. We need to keep, even though the official march on Washington that he had envisioned in 1941, he had agreed not to do. He's still saying that we need to engage in political activity to achieve a kind of democracy for African Americans in the midst of this fight against fascism abroad. And you have these letters from an African American man named Rupert Trimmingham to Yank magazine, which was the military publication, in which he talks about sort of the hypocrisy or about the difficulty of being in a Jim Crow army. Even German prisoners of war are treated better than he is. And just a few other examples. We have documents on the Brown decision. Those legal documents can be sometimes hard to sift through, but then you have this wonderful reaction to it from Zora Neale Hurston on presidential politics, from Truman to Kennedy to Johnson, and Johnson with this really expansive vision for civil rights that he ends up sort of backing off on in 65 from Howard. For Martin Luther King, we have so many documents and wonderful speeches, but I saw in the chat about sort of the tracing of his intellectual evolution, and these are documents that would help with that. On women, anyone from Fannie Lou Hamer to Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm, of course, as she running before she runs for president, and sort of aligning herself with second wave feminism and with the women's movement, and seeing that as intimately connected to her struggle as an African American. On Black Power, from Malcolm X to Stokely Carmichael, and so on. And so I hope these are the kinds of documents that might help to make your conversations with your students a little bit more specific. They might sort of be able to use them as evidence and to assess them. They could help with writing assignments. You know the lay of the land best in your classroom about how effective they've been.